Hello and welcome to episode 32 of the Wilder podcast, where we speak with Jyoti Banerjee, co-founder of North Star Transition. In this chat, we discuss the origins of North Star, the importance of a systemic approach to solving the meta crisis, and the landscapes where this work has already begun.
First question, before we start this chat, what is a meta crisis for those that may be new to the podcast and haven't been through our back catalogue and heard it mentioned a number of times?
It's quite a big term to define at the start of the podcast, but I'll give it a go. My understanding of the term meta crisis is it's the recognition that although we exist within a climate crisis and an ecological crisis, there are many other crises that intersect with that, whether that's inequality, mental health. And actually, we need to take a step back and look at the wider context in which all of these crises are interrelated and actually what's underpinning them all, which is maybe the big question that we're all struggling with ultimately.
So it's a catch-all for all the depressing things that are happening in the world. Is that what you're trying to tell me?
That's a great summary, Tom.
Good. Okay, that's what I'm here for. So we are Chloe and Tom. We are husband and wife. I just thought I'd introduce us before we get into the chat. We are part of the Grange Project, where we're rewilding our project here. And this podcast is a documented journey as we educate and teach ourselves all about what we need to know about nature recovery. But also it's an amazing opportunity to speak to some fascinating guests. And today is, well, it's pretty awesome, pretty thought-provoking. And I think that our listeners are going to love it.
It's definitely up there as one of my favourite episodes so far.
As is tradition, we give a very short update, and this one will be super short because the chat is long and interesting. So, Chloe, what's the update for us on the project?
Perhaps before we jump into what's happened in the physical land of the project, is it worth sharing a bit about some of the work we've done in helping people to connect with our story via the podcast?
So, I massively should have mentioned that earlier. So we've done some work on the website. If you are new, we now realise we're starting to get to the point where we've got more and more episodes, and that could be slightly overwhelming. So if you go to the website, and also the link will be in the show notes with /podcast, we've now created these journeys. So you can now segment the podcast into areas that you're specifically interested in. So you've got Tom's best picks, Chloe's best picks of the podcast. We've also got the rewilding episodes. We've got the ecopreneurship episodes, and a whole bunch of ways in which you can pick apart our podcast series and enjoy the areas of specialism or specific areas that you're, as a listener, want to listen to. Does that make sense?
I think so. Certainly my experience has been that when you connect with a new podcast and there's more than 10 episodes, it can be a bit overwhelming as to where to start. So hopefully this will be a useful resource for people that are new to us and wanting to kind of get a quick summary of where we're at without having to spend hours of your life investing into hearing our voices chatting away.
And there's also a section for our journey, which is the journey of the improvements to the project that we're working on here. So we've got one cool announcement or update to talk about from one of our partners that we've had on the podcast previously. But before we do that, Chloe, just give us one quick update on the project.
Well, I guess the most significant update is that the Wilder Lodge now has a floor, which means that we can get a real sense of how the space is going to feel, where you're positioned and looking over the landscape, and I'm really excited.
Yeah, so for those that are new to the podcast, we have invested in converting one of our barns, which is in the centre of the project, to become our hub, our centre of activity where people can come and really enjoy and be immersed in nature. So a lot of work's been going on. It's been going on for months and months, but we're starting to see things come out of the ground now, which is super exciting. Shall I talk about Citizen Zoo now?
Yeah, because I think it's a great update that might be relevant to loads of our listeners.
So our friends over at Citizen Zoo, and the link to the episode that we interviewed them will be in the show notes, they've actually reached out to ask us if we can help promote their conference. It's a Citizen Zoo Rewilding Conference. It's going to be held on the 17th and 18th of January next year in Cambridge at the world-renowned David Attenborough building. And it's pretty cool. If you start digging into this event, the who's who of the rewilding world is going to be there. Quite literally, we looked through the speaker names and it's just everybody, basically, apart from us. I noticed that we were not on that list. But other than that, not suggested we are the who's who. It's just a fantastic opportunity to look into the future of rewilding and how to shape tomorrow's wild world, as they would say on their little blurb bit. So if you are interested in rewilding and you want to really get a finger on the pulse of the forward-leaning organisations and what's happening across the UK, and then have a look at the link in the show notes and potentially look to sign up.
Yeah, I'm sensing a need for a babysitter so we can have a mini break to Cambridge.
That'd be nice. Probably less likely this year. Next year, we'll absolutely be there. Cool. Shall we get on with the interview?
I think so. I found this chat with Jyothi super inspiring because he takes one of my favourite things, which is the systemic approach, and considers how to apply it to landscape, national level problems. So he's thinking about bringing people together, interconnectivity, locally owned solutions. And beyond that, he's thinking about how do we finance this, which is a really interesting topic that we haven't really stepped into much on the podcast.
because of his experience from out of sector in the commercial world, he understands a lot more about financing and financing options. And I think that is a really important missing piece of the puzzle. It's a great chat. Chloe and I will do some reflecting on it afterwards, but here's the interview.
Hello, Jyothi, and welcome to the Wilder podcast.
Well, thank you very much. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
We are equally really excited to have a conversation that looks at a landscape from a slightly different perspective. But perhaps before we step into that, it'd be wonderful if you were able to introduce yourself and North Star Transition.
I guess the question is, how far back should I go? I'm from New Delhi. I was born in India, and I came 30 odd years ago to the United Kingdom, chasing after this young lady, actually. I've done a variety of things. So I've spent much of the 90s basically being an entrepreneur in the tech sector in the UK and in Silicon Valley. In 2001, I got involved in setting up a venture fund that invested in businesses committed to making a difference in their environment. And I've also been involved in helping shape a new corporate reporting framework that challenged corporations to be more holistic in their reporting practice. So I guess these are some of the strands that have shaped my journey, the strands being tech and innovation, finance, and a holistic business practice.
That's really interesting because a lot of our conversations today have been people with more of a kind of ecological background. But what we need is people from all sectors to come together to try and create these solutions. So yeah, really interested to hear things from kind of your unique perspective. And tell us a little bit about North Star Transition. So how did that come about and what are its hopes?
So North Star Transition is the result of an ongoing discussion that I was having with the person who became the co-founder of the organization, and that's Olivier Boutelis. Olivier is based in Brussels, and he and I would often think about some of the largest corporations in the world and the actions that they were taking and thinking, so how are we going to get out of the mess that we're in? And, we have a climate crisis, we have a biodiversity crisis, we have a water crisis, we have a health crisis, whatever crisis you want to name. The largest corporations in the world play a role in them. And between the 1,000 largest corporations, they contribute about 40% of global GDP. So our interest was really in asking these huge and very well-resourced corporations, what are they doing about these various crises that we face? And everywhere we went, the answer seemed basically to be, we've got a net zero plan. And to me, a net zero plan is largely a carbon plan. So it's like, okay, so how's your net zero plan going? Well, it's not going that great at the moment, it turns out, because everyone's got some more important and more immediate agenda items to deal with. And perhaps they haven't quite got the resources together to get their plan up and running, or they haven't yet quite put the team together to do it, or whatever the reason. It's not perhaps going so well. And then you say, okay, so you have a net zero plan that's not going so well. What about biodiversity? Are you dealing with that? Oh, no, that's not our problem. Really? Okay. So what about the health inequalities crisis? Well, that's definitely not our problem. We're a bank. Or, okay, what about inequalities? Well, these politicians should do something about it. And I was just listening to all these conversations and thinking, wow, these are some of the best resourced organizations on planet Earth. They can actually make a decision that they're going to do something, and they can bring the resources to make that decision happen. And they're not doing anything about it. So how are we going to actually deal with this stuff? Is there a way we know how to deal with it? And it seemed like really we didn't know how we were going to deal with these various crises facing us. So Olivier and I took on the challenge on behalf of planet Earth, of course, to solve the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis and the health crisis and the water crisis and any other crisis you want to name. But we thought we shouldn't just have a goal of solving any one of them. We need to solve all of them at the same time, because just imagine how silly it would look if we do solve the carbon crisis and it turns out we forgot to do the biodiversity crisis. And that just wouldn't make any sense, and it would look really bad on our CVs. So I thought we got to go after all of them. And we're in the place of not being ecologists. We're not environmentalists. We're not farmers. We're not health professionals. Sadly, we're economists. And so quite often the response when you have that kind of background and looking at the challenges you face is that we just thought, well, let's set up a company. Let's see what we can do. And so North Star Transition started 4 years ago, actually. It was our attempt at solving all these different crises. As you can tell, the crises still exist, so we must have done a really poor job. So
I so appreciate what you're saying there, because it really tunes into my experience of systems thinking, which is this idea of interconnectivity, which in some ways is a really simple, this idea that an action in one context has an effect on another context. But when we're all working in silos, in our own little niches, it's sometimes hard to make the connections between Rewilding Project and health inequality, or between financial corporations and the impact that might have on biodiversity. So to take that lens and zoom out and appreciate the wider connections between all of these different spheres completely speaks to me when I think about some of the training I've done historically. I feel tempted to think more about that strategic context, but I know the focus of our conversation today is going to be on one of the landscapes in which you're attempting to apply these principles. So on that basis, it would be great to hear a little bit more about some of the work that North Star is actually undertaking and what that might look like.
yes, I guess if you're going to set yourself the sort of goals that we have, the next obvious question is, what have you done about it? And our first little idea that we were wrestling with was we didn't want to start something small that might be perfectly formed, but actually make no difference whatsoever in the bigger context. So, if we were going to set up, let's say, a 1-acre model farm on the edge of Patagonia, could actually be an amazingly regenerative place which doesn't have a climate crisis or a biodiversity crisis or a health crisis. But actually nobody would care about it, at least not the people who are doing all the degenerative things out there. So we wanted a scale of activity that we could look at and say, okay, we have satisfied ourselves that we are learning how to do this big stuff, but also it would be credible to others. So the case study we decided to go after was Wales. How would we make Wales into a place that was regenerative? And when I say that, it's very easy to interpret that as being, well, are you saying Wales is not a regenerative place? Is it a degenerative place? And I would say, yes, I absolutely agree. Wales is a degenerative place, but so is every other part of planet Earth where we have taken our business and financial system. We have made it into a degenerative place. So I guess I should define my terms. What does it mean to be regenerative and what does it mean to be degenerative? If I could make a small confession here, I have no idea what it means to be regenerative. I heard farmers talk about being regenerative and I thought, wow, that's a cool description. And why would you not want to be regenerative? So then when I use the word regenerative, what do I mean? I actually mean that we don't have the opposite of regenerative. The opposite of regenerative to me is degenerative. And the kind of degenerative outcomes we see on planet Earth are the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis and the inequalities crisis and the health crisis, etc. These are all degenerative outcomes of the same system. So to me, a regenerative system would be one that didn't have these degenerative outcomes. So that's my kind of starter for working definition. And then you ask the question, so what are you doing about it? Having picked Wales as the place we wanted to start and test our ideas, we brought a group of people together who came from across 3 different systems: health, environment, and food or farming. And the question for us was really, if we wanted to see a regenerative Wales, these huge systems which have massive interactions and impacts on each other would have to align in a way that weren't just generating degenerative outcomes. And that's such a complicated thing to do, especially when it turns out that the people in food don't know the people in health, and the people in health don't know the people in environment, and haven't even begun to think about the huge cross impacts. So just to put this in context, in Wales, we spend 250 million or so a year subsidizing farmers. So that's something that happens in the food system. We spend 500 million a year dealing with diabetes, which is one health outcome from the way we have structured our food system and our lifestyles, etc. And you just have to think about that, to think we actually spend double the amount of money we spend on farmers, with just fixing one of the problems we face because of the ill effects of the system we've constructed. So we started with this concept called Wye Usk Transition Lab. How would we shift Wales into a new space, bringing food and health and nature into the same conversation? And pretty soon that conversation also brought in water and local government and national government and business and finance. And we started seeing actions happening out of that work that hadn't been imagined before. So for example, today, Vilindra, one of the NHS trusts across Wales, has a food strategy, the first one of its kind. And that's exciting for us to see because it was a direct outworking of something that started within Wye Usk Transition Lab. But people were challenging us to say, can you do this work that you have started in Wye Usk Transition Lab? Can you actually do it in a landscape? And the landscape that was proposed to us was really the River Wye. And it's not such a surprise that you have the Wye as the challenging landscape, because I read about the Wye and other rivers like the Wye about once a month at least in my newspapers. It's front page news. And when a river gets to be front page news, it's usually not because, isn't this such a beautiful place? Isn't it lovely that we can go there? It's because the river is in a crisis. And so we looked at the idea that the Wye is in crisis. People have been dealing with it for a long time. And yet perhaps there was something that we could bring into this discussion that was more uniquely how we have constructed our transition lab. So we've gone for that. So we're thinking about how a nation can be changed. We're thinking about how landscapes can be changed. And separately, we also have a separate line, which is thinking about how corporations can transition going forward. So those are our main lines of action.
It's so exciting to have these sorts of conversations because it's great to have the ideals. And I think what you suggested in terms of this idea of kind of interconnectivity and widening the context to include all these different spheres makes complete sense intuitively. But how you translate that into something practical can sometimes feel a lot harder. So it's great to be able to think about this example of the River Wye in this landscape in relation to what North Star Transition's done and what the kind of hopeful outcomes are from that project. Perhaps we could start off by just talking a little bit about, you mentioned the rivers in crisis. I wonder if you can give us a little bit of context as to your perspective as to what do we mean by that crisis and how has that come about?
So over the last 20 years, we have seen environmentalists and activists and fishermen and various different groups picking up their cudgels on behalf of the river. There are many reasons for this. One, the river has lost much of its natural vegetation because of the impact of the pollution that has been caused by others. So you have farm runoff entering into the river, and the farms are using chemicals like pesticides and fertilizers, etc. And that stuff runs off from the soil into the river and ends up polluting the river. And so we've lost flora. We've also lost fish and other living things in the river. So people tell me there's a 95% reduction in the salmon population in the river over the last 20 years. So you have that kind of situation. You've got a situation that the river is not clean or healthy enough because we don't want our kids to get into the river anymore. Because apart from the chemicals that are in there, we've also got sewage entering the rivers. In the UK, it's legal for a water company to release untreated sewage into the river at particular times. But it does mean you got to question, would you want to get into the river if that's the kind of stuff that you're going to find in it? But it's not just the river. And that's the important thing to note, is we have been impacting the entire landscape as well. So the fact that our soils are being managed in particular ways means that the soil is no longer alive and well enough to be able to attenuate the flow of water when a rain splash event happens on it, which means that we end up with rainwater streaming through the soils faster than ever before. We have more rainwater than ever before because of the climate crisis. And the natural outcome of that is you end up with all the rainwater showing up at the bottom of the river at the same time, and that's called a flood. So we have these sort of issues that seem almost independent and isolated on their own. But actually, because the river and the landscape is like a living thing, all of these issues impact each other. Even the use of the chemicals on the land, it's there because farmers believe that that is going to enhance their yield. And they've been trained by years, even decades, of signaling from government and other sources that they should maximize their yield. And they are rewarded for that through the subsidy program. And instead, what we have now found is that the massive use of chemicals has actually so degraded the soil that we've ended up with soil that is almost lifeless. And so you can't grow stuff in that soil unless you use even more chemicals. So we're in this cycle where everything is making everything else worse. And it really doesn't help us at all. And that is to ignore some other issues. Like, for example, Public Health Wales says there's a near 20-year life expectancy gap between the people who live in rural poverty in the center of the landscapes versus the people who live in relative luxury at the bottom of the catchments in the cities. So are these issues we're prepared to accept? Do we just say, okay, that's how it works, so that that's the system we've constructed? Or should we be doing something to address this?
Hence the Wye Usk Transition Lab, which it sounds like this is what you've put together as task force to address. That is the main effort of today's conversation, to really understand what you and your team are going to do to try and address all of these issues. And I thank you for being so articulate in explaining all of the crises addressing the rivers. But just before we jump into what you and your team are going to be doing, you mentioned that we've known about this and the effects on the river for a long time. There have been myriad of groups trying to address these issues. I'd just love to hear, briefly what you think they have been doing and why maybe they haven't achieved the impact that we all hope that they can achieve.
That's a really good question. And I fear that there's no trivial answer to it. If we have had loads and loads of different people and groups of stakeholders all collaborating with each other and have all ended up with the situation that the river is actually worse off than it was 20 years ago, then we got to ask the question, are we doing the right thing to deal with the problem? And our fundamental challenge is that all the different pieces are interconnected to each other. And if that is the case, then we can't have a single point solution that fixes the problem for everybody. Is there a magic silver bullet that if we just did this one thing, it'll fix it? And yet so often what we find is that people go after the magic silver bullet. So what if we could just change how farmers work? Well, that would be great. But will it fix the problems? Well, not the range of problems that we've just discussed. What if we could just get the salmon back in the river? Will that be enough of a driver to cause all the changes that we need? Well, maybe some of the things will get fixed, but not all of them will get fixed. What if we just said, it's those water companies? If only they did the right thing, that'll be it. Really? Well, it's not going to fix it. Because guess what? We've got 24 million chickens being reared on the banks of the Wye. And somehow or the other, the poo from those chickens ends up in the Wye. So is there one answer? No. So then the question becomes, do we have to do a variety of these things? Yes. But more than that, we need to do a variety of these things in alignment with each other, so not contesting with each other. But more fundamentally than that, we can't just fix the wound without asking, how did the wound get caused in the first place? And so if the wound we're going to fix is get nitrates or phosphates out of the river, which is one of the big strands of action that you see out there, my thing is, how long before you've got a new bunch of nitrates and phosphates back in the river? Because that's what farmers put every single year on their land. So for me, the fundamental issue that we need to be prepared to ask is, how do we change the standard practice, the business model, the fundamental operating model of the stakeholders who are there, so that they're not continuing to cause the problems that we are currently seeing? So if we want to get the nitrates and the phosphates out of the river, how do we make sure they never get on the land in the first place? Well, that's a pretty tough thing to do because 98% of farmers use nitrates and phosphates. I'm aware that on your farm, that's not going to be the case. But for most of them, that is how they work. That's just their normal practice. So how do we get them to a place where they act like the 2% who don't use phosphates and nitrates and any other chemicals? well, that would require a fundamental change of business model for them. And so for me, the interesting question isn't, can we get the phosphates and nitrates out of the river? It's, can we change the operating model for those people who use phosphates and nitrates as part of their standard operating practice? And that is the fundamental question that somehow has evaded the answer. But also, it ends up being a much more complicated and expensive process. And it's not just a technical process anymore. It's not saying, can we clean the river up and remove some sludge from it? It's about saying, can we change the behavior, the practices, the culture, the understood models of working? Can we change that for a whole generation of people?
Music's my ears, and I'm going to ask a really naive question, so I do apologize here. But I think it might be some of the things that some of the listeners might be thinking. What you're describing there, I'm so aware how naive this sounds. What you're describing there, you'd like to think that government is taking that holistic view that should be going, right, okay, this is something we truly can influence. This is I'm going to step up now as government to make these changes and do this analysis and research. So I'm keen to understand why you think that Wye and Usk Transition Lab is required instead of just going, the government saying, I'm going to take on this problem and help solve it.
Well, if we had governments that were willing to tackle the big picture challenges that we're facing today, then we wouldn't need Wye Usk Transition Lab. The reality is, it's not just government, but across leadership around the world. So in that, I include governments, but I also include corporations and their leaders, and a host of other leaders as well, of non-governmental organizations, etc. If we were prepared to take on the big challenges, then yeah, you don't need an entity like the Wye Usk Transition Lab to come along. However, we're in a state where government's job is basically to keep the machine moving as it currently is set up. Ideally, with a little bit of improvement along the way, maybe a 5% or 10% change. But government's not there to smash the system apart and reimagine it and reconstruct it in new ways. Their job is to keep the machine going as it currently is. So we see our opportunity at a place like the Wye Usk Transition Lab is to allow people the space to think, okay, if we could do this differently, how would we do it? Why would we want to continue doing this? Should we be doing that? And it's a completely free and open space for those kinds of ideas to be aired, to be tested, to be reimagined in terms of how they could work. And ideally, we would still get government involved, but we would do so when we can go to them with a nearly ready package and say, by the way, if you just put your little wrapper on this, you could actually make something happen here that was at a scale that would be meaningful and impactful. And I think governments largely need that kind of encouragement. They want to get involved in something that people have already bought into. It's pretty clear where the resources will come from. And ideally, they look like absolute heroes when they do it. They don't want to be out there doing the tough stuff, battling everybody because it's what they believe to be the right thing to do. So I think Wye Usk Transition Lab's best opportunity would be to allow that reimagining of how the system would work, but get it to a point that it's actually credible and supported by a large number of people so that government would say, that's the way we want to go.
I think that's a really fascinating point about the government's role being about keeping the machine going. And it's actually made me think, perhaps even wider than that, how for all of us, it feels like within our current economic system where productivity is valued so highly, we're all just trying to keep the machine going. And there's opportunities to step back and reflect, to consider what is the role that I'm playing on this wider system and how could that be different is a luxury in our current system. And I'm curious about how with the Wye Usk transition, you're creating those spaces and those opportunities. I'm imagining there's lots of people coming together, there's facilitation and creation of conversation, but I'd love to hear more about what do those spaces actually look like if we were to observe them? How do you create those contexts of conversation?
So the Wye Usk Transition Lab has been going for about just over 18 months at this stage. And it currently has over 200 participants in it. And a participant could be an individual farmer or landowner. It could be an NHS health board. It could be the Environment Agency and anything in between. It's got a variety of different types of individuals and organizations participating in it. They come from many different corners of the system. And we have developed a transition lab as a joint activity with the Climate Action Unit at UCL. The Climate Action Unit sounds like it's a bunch of climatologists, but it's actually led by Dr. Chris DeMeyer, who is a behavioral scientist. And so we've benefited from the ability to bring behavioral science into the challenge of getting people who are disconnected from each other, beginning to learn how they can engage together, how they can collaborate together, how they can imagine together stuff that doesn't currently exist, and also think about how they can make that stuff real. So a transition lab is a venue where we bring people together to begin that process of listening to each other. And when I say listening, I mean actually listening. So often we listen to each other just so that we can put in our bit and say, you know what, I've got a better idea than you have. Or at least I'm guilty of that so often. And yet, actually, what I need to be able to do is to sit back and really understand you, because you've got a completely different set of experiences. You've got a completely different skill set, and you bring a different perspective to the same issue that I'm looking at. So we need to learn to talk to each other. And that's partly the challenge that we look at in a transition lab. But more than just talking to each other, we need to learn to be able to test each other's ideas out. We need to learn to develop them to a place where they can actually work. And so within the Wye Usk Transition Lab, we found that there are 6 different areas that people are interested in seeing change in. And I can summarize those 6 areas for you. The first one is that we need a profitable and resilient farming model for the 21st century in the Wye Usk landscape. I'm picking those words really carefully. A profitable and resilient farming model is important because farming today is not profitable. The average earning of a Welsh farm is minus £7,000 per year. That's not a profitable activity. Okay, there are dairy farmers where the average earning is £139,000 per year, but across Welsh farming, it's minus 7,000. So it actually doesn't make sense to be a farmer if it wasn't for the fact that most farmers believe that's the only thing they know what to do. And they've got the land, what else are they going to do? And then a spouse has to go off and get some other kind of work just so that the family can stay put together. So we need a profitable farming model, but we also need it to be resilient, because actually farming is only going to become more complicated in the light of the biodiversity crisis, in the light of the carbon crisis, etc. So that's the first thing. Secondly, we need a new form of income diversification that goes beyond what has become the standard form at the moment, which is poultry, intensive poultry. We need to do something different. And what we are exploring is renewable energy, but not renewable energy where you install some PV panels or wind or whatever and then sell that to the grid. Because let's be honest about it, at the moment, the grid is not set up to take large quantities of locally produced electricity. So that's an unworkable model. But actually, that's also the wrong model for the future of energy, because the energy model that we have today was constructed in an era where we buy our energy from somewhere in the Middle East, we bring it over to the UK or from the North Sea, and then we process it centrally and distribute it out to every household. That's yesterday's model. We need a new model. So we're now exploring what would a locally owned, locally generated, local distribution of energy look like across a landscape. And that's what we're exploring. We know that we need to clean up the river. And by that, I mean not just clean it up, but we need to make it healthy. We know we need to change what's happening in the landscape. And by that, I mean, we need to think about where are we putting our trees, what's happening to peat restoration, what's happening with flood management, nature-based solutions, etc. We also know we have to deal with the health inequalities because of the 20-year life expectancy gap. And we know that actually we need a transport mechanism that's going to be sustainable across the Wye and Usk landscape, because most of the time, the answer for transport seems to be diesel vehicles. So we need to find another model to make that work, not just because it would be a good thing to lower our carbon, but it's also air pollution issues which cause health impacts, and because we need to use the energy that we're going to generate locally. So we're thinking about what would be a transformation model that works across each of these segments. So that's what the people inside the Transition Lab are working on.
I'm really interested about how you invite people into the space, or whether they're self-selecting, or how you reach out to make sure you've got as many voices and perspectives represented as possible. I think it's quite prominent in my mind as I went to a Lower Wye Valley Climate Action meeting last week, which is the first meeting of this new network. And the representation was almost entirely local government, parish councils and environmental groups. There was nobody there from any corporate settings. There was no young people. It felt like it was a very particular group, which then obviously creates a very particular conversation and culture within that space. And it's not to say that that isn't valid and helpful, but like you're saying, we've got to step out of these spaces to invite in all perspectives to generate creative solutions. So yeah, I'm wondering about how people get invited into the space.
The truth of it is that we don't live in the Wye. At least I don't live in the Wye. Some of my colleagues do. So I wouldn't be able to go and invite anybody. But what has happened is that if you can start with a small group of people who get what you're doing, they all know people who they think would love to get involved in this. So Wye Usk Transition Lab started as a conversation between 12 people. And we didn't go out and advertise and say, we're doing this, you should come and join us. But it's now got hundreds and hundreds of stakeholders collaborating with each other. And they represent many different corners of the system, but also different age groups, etc. So I think part of it has simply been, can we create a place where we can do something compelling and different? But also, what's the ambition of what we want to do here? We don't just want to fix the river, if it's possible to use that kind of language. We want to transform the landscape. We want the landscape to be an amazingly healthy and a place that people will find joy in, a place that they'd want to raise their families in, a place of well-being and prosperity. And right now, we don't have that. So we need to think about how we can get there. So the goal of the Wye Usk Transition Lab process is to be able to create that kind of outcome for the Transition Lab. So right now, we're working on meeting 3 objectives. 1, we want a plan that would actually be transformational for the entire landscape, not just for the river or for a few farmers or for the health people. It's got to be transformational and transformative for everybody. Secondly, we want something that people really buy into and are supportive of and feel if only we could get that, we would dive in immediately and do it. So we need it to be locally owned. And third, we need it to be investable. And we haven't talked much about this so far, but we should talk about it because the scale of change that is needed, transforming how the water company works or how flood management will work or how farmers will work or how the health system will work or energy or transport or any of these issues is going to require a scale of resources that is certainly not going to be available from the public purse. And so often, most of the actions that people are talking about are in terms of what can we get from government to fund X, Y, Z change. Whereas we think, if we're going to be honest about this, the scale of change we need is to be able to help people move from operating model A to operating model B. And they don't know how to do it. They don't have the resources to make that change. They can't bear the risk of that change going sour. But what if we could find the resources to enable that to happen? Well, that scale of resources we have judged to be over £1 billion for the Wye Usk landscape. And we know that we will need to bring in large scales of finance, enable that kind of change to happen.
Yeah, well, I mean, you can't just drop that amount of money, in a conversation, and not elaborate. Where does one start looking for £1 billion? And when you say investable, could you define what that means, if at all possible?
Sure. I use the word investable very carefully because I want to distinguish investable from fundable. Fundable often means, can I get a government grant or some lottery funding to pay for something? And that's fine if what you need is the money to put in a new hedgerow. Or if maybe there are 10 farmers and they're going to collaborate on doing something different with how they do dairy farming. And they need their supply chain master, like say Arla as a dairy company or Tesco as the buyer, to support some changes in their practices. Well, that's fine. But what if we also need 10,000 farmers to shift the way they function and to help them transition from one kind of farming model to a different farming model. For most of them, they'd say, hey, I don't know that I'm using the wrong model, but even if I could shift to another model, how on earth can I do it? Because it could take my farm 5 to 7 years to transition out of the chemical farming model I use today. Now, who's going to fund us for those 5 to 7 years? And what happens if it all goes wrong at the end of that? And remember, we're talking to people whose average earning is minus £7,000 per year. Well, then this is the wrong conversation to be having with them. Yes, except what if we could actually fund them through that transition? But not fund 1 or 10 or 100, but do this at the scale of thousands. So that's why when we start adding up the bill for carrying out all the changes, it's quite significant. And that's why I think of it as being an investable sum of money. Now, investable means someone's going to invest. And we think of an investment into a landscape as requiring a blending together of public money, of private money, because citizens will participate in this if they had the opportunity to do so. But we can't depend on them doing so, especially if their shoulders are weak. We need private money, the likes of the corporations who participate in the landscape to get involved. We need financial institutions like pension funds and wealth funds, etc., to do some of the heavy lifting. And there are going to be some bits of what we're wanting to do which will be totally unfundable by anybody, certainly not investors. And we will need that covered by philanthropy. And so we need to really blend all these different sources of finance into one package. But the real challenge has been, how do you get the financial institutions involved? Because they have no track record of being involved in this sort of thing without simply buying up landscapes and planting trees.
Okay, when we talk about those sums of money and talking about private investors or institutional investors, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I believe they're going to want to see a traditional return on investment, either take chunks of the business in terms of share equity or whatever that might be. So it's maybe going into the weeds a little bit, but I'm interested to hear your thoughts on how you're going to attract those people who, as we discussed earlier, can't even get their net zero policies or plans enacted correctly.
I guess we need to be clear that when we engage with financial institutions at North Star Transition, we're often engaging with individuals at those institutions. These are individuals who are in leadership positions, but these are also individuals who believe that life needs to look different. Their institution cannot keep doing what they do, but they don't know how to do anything differently. They have the same lack of understanding of what the future could look like as any of the rest of us. So instead, we all need to walk on this journey of discovery of what the next model could look like. And so we have 13 financial institutions who have been collaborating with us to explore what an investment model could look like for them. And of course, they aren't there because they are going to do this out of the goodness of their hearts. These institutions still have the rules that they operate by, their self-imposed rules, which is, this is the kind of return we need, these are the products we're going to sell. And we are exploring with them how it will be possible for them to participate in the kind of actions we are seeking to carry out. And the reason why they want to join in with this discussion is because they know that the conversation we're having about the Wye and Usk will be repeated over and over and over again right around planet Earth, wherever we've taken our business system and ended up with the degenerative outcomes I talked about earlier. So this is as much a learning process for them. And you asked the question, Tom, what do they want to get out of it? Well, for some of them, yes, it's a learning process. For some of them, it's because they have other objectives that go beyond money. But the real interest that I'm focused on is, how do we make this an activity that has an economic return for them? And once you get into that territory, then you have to accept that there are going to be quite a few financial institutions who will have zero interest in what you're doing, because they need to be able to show right from the start that they're going to get 10% or 12% returns on their investments. And we're not going to be getting that from the sort of transformations we're talking about here. So who would give it? Well, pension funds have long-term horizons and long-term obligations, and they are willing to explore this kind of idea. Sovereign wealth funds are there to help reshape the working of our systems, and they are interested in how they can use their funds. And there are some philanthropists who are operating at a very large scale, or rather I should describe them as wealthy families and individuals who often invest their money in actions that will continue to give a return to their family foundations and trusts. But they also get that they need to have a longer term view, and so they will get involved. So this isn't just something that any old bank will rock up for. Quite a few of them would simply turn their nose up at it. But there are some who want to learn how this is going to work, and we need them to be part of the direction that we're going in.
And how far are you away, do you think, from seeing some of this finance coming into the landscape, or perhaps seeing actions being generated as a result of the Wye Usk Transition Lab?
The crazy thing is that there's loads of money out there. The money is not the problem. The problem is having a plan that is actually credible for carrying out the change needed and for selling to the financial institutions. We don't have a plan that is credible for transformation. It is not transformational to get nutrients out of the river. Just not transformational for the area. It's not transformational to get the salmon back into the river. Not transformational. Not transformational to put some PV on a few roofs. Not transformational. We need to find a way to assemble a credible transformational plan, and then we can offer that to institutions who are simply saying, show us your plan today that we can buy into. So if we had a plan today, we could have the money now, but we don't have a plan. So we have started a process at Wye Usk Transition Lab that will take us, we think, the next 18 months to get to the point where we could actually have what we think would be a credible plan if we were to take it out to financial institutions. And we've got to be careful with this. You don't want to go with a stupid plan that people will turn around and say, so is that it? Is that what you were going to do? Well, forget it. We're not interested. It's got to be something that people on the ground believe will be transformational and the institutions believe will be transformational. We need them all to walk on this journey together. And we think we'll need another 18 months to get there. But if we could have a plan that is transformational, we could have a plan that is locally owned, we could have a plan that is investable, then we think we've got the right ingredients at that point to have a credible conversation about what happens next. And it's not just about finding money. Some people say to us, oh, you know people who've got £1 billion, just hand it over. We know what needs to be done. And I would say to them very gently, you do not know what needs to be done, because you don't just get £1 billion from anybody. You have to create the right institutions to allow the money to come in. You have to create the right institutions to allow multiple stakeholders to collaborate together. And you have to create actions that are going to be credible and which people are committed to. So there's a lot of work that needs to happen from talking about £1 billion and receiving it. But that's the work we're engaged in right now.
But then, once you've received it, the next question is then how do you communicate it to the stakeholders on the Wye and Usk? How do you go, look, we've found the money. I would almost argue the uphill battle of communicating it to chicken farms, wherever it might be, going, look, there's money here. Yes, you're going to have to change from method A to method B, but we're here to help you with that. But that is easily said than done.
Yeah, but that's why we want a plan that they would have bought into in the development thereof. So this isn't simply going to them and saying, hey, guess what? We've rocked up at your door and we're now going to tell you how to do farming. Well, people have asked me, what credibility would you have to go to a farmer and talk about farming models with them? And sometimes I flippantly say, well, my mother was born on a coffee plantation in the south of India. Mm-hmm. For whatever reason, it buys me zero in terms of credibility in the Wye Usk landscape for telling farmers how to do stuff. We need them to be part of the journey with us, of thinking about what are the changes we need to see happen. We need them to believe it. We need them to be waiting for these changes to come through. And that's the journey we need to carry out over the next 18 months.
Do you think you are getting those people coming to provide their points of view? There's a famous picture of a Spitfire in World War II where the engineers all looked at where the Spitfires came home and put all the bullet holes of where they got shot, and they go, right, we need to up armor and put more armor on the places they get shot. And then someone sat there and said, well, actually, there's these big gaps here. Do you think we should have been looking at the ones that actually got shot down? And so actually they worked out that the gaps and the issue in the places they had to up armor were the areas that didn't have bullet holes, because that's what caused a catastrophic failure. So it's a long way of saying, from my perspective, do you think you're getting the right stakeholders who maybe are less inclined for change, are they coming forward to try and give their perspective, or is there work to be done to bring them to the table?
I'm sure at this point we have got a very incomplete set of stakeholders. So although we have got representatives from across farming and energy and health, etc., they must be a really, really incomplete lot. And what we're doing is carrying out a process to help share our ideas. So we're not carrying this out as a black box exercise. No one has an idea what our plan is going to look like. No one knows where the money is going to come from. Instead, we want a completely open process. So over the next, well, certainly by January or so, we will start circulating an initial document amongst the people who are the current stakeholders in the Wye Usk Transition Lab to say, these are the ideas that have emerged. This is what could happen if we were to create a plan. What do you think? We want to share that because we want people to have kind of two reactions to it. One would be, wow, these guys are so foolish. They have missed the biggest things that need to happen. If only they knew that. Well, actually, I'm going to go and tell them about the stuff that they've missed. So if someone came along with that view, I'd say, come on in. We welcome you. We want to learn what would actually be transformational out there. Or a second perspective is people who say, okay, I didn't think it might be possible to do this stuff, but what if this could happen? It looks like there's a train leaving the station. I want to get involved. I want to get on board just to learn and perhaps bring some of my ideas to it. Well, that would be a wonderful reaction too, and we would welcome them in. So we are going to share this document, and we call it version 0.1. And as soon as the initial stakeholders have seen it, we will just share it widely. In fact, I'd welcome your input. Maybe we can discuss it on the pod in future as to, what are the actions? Because within Wye Usk Transition Lab, we have surfaced, through the work of the behavioral science team, we have surfaced 105 interventions that could be carried out across the Wye and Usk landscape. And some of them are going to be amazing, and some of them are really irrelevant. But we don't know at this stage which is going to work in which way. So we will walk a process to help people connect with them, say, okay, you've got 105, but actually you've missed the 5 things that really are needed. Or just focus on these 3 things because this will make a difference, or these 20 things, or whatever it is. And then we will take those ideas and continue to develop them. And we'll develop business plans around them and financial plans. And that's the way we will get from what we are currently calling version 0.1. We need to get to version 1.0. And that's the journey that we're on. You can see a little bit of my software background coming to bear on this, where version 0.1 is not a product anybody wants to use, but we're still going to share it just to get ideas and to get feedback, but also, more importantly, to give people a sense of the direction of travel that we could all be in.
It's that time again. It is getting towards the end of this podcast. I've loved it. The time has flown by. If this was a video podcast, all you would have seen is Chloe and I's heads just nodding the whole way through. I have made myself dizzy halfway through this from nodding too much, which is, I think, a good problem to have. So thank you very much for all the work you're doing. Not only the intelligence that you've brought to a problem, but I think it's the emotional intelligence, I think, is the thing that I like hearing. It's look, we're going to be smart about this, but we've also got to be sympathetic in the way that we engage with all the stakeholders and drive real change. So that's really exciting. Before we close off, is there anything that anyone else would like to say?
I think just to echo that, absolutely love the approach that you've taken. It feels really coherent with my value set, my ways of viewing the world, and I completely see where you're coming from. And yeah, really excited to see how this develops and feel privileged really to be part of a landscape where we hope we might see some of the effects of this work. For those people that might be feeling similarly to me, where can we continue to follow your progress? Where should we go to see the plan, to hear the thoughts and see how this develops?
The best way of keeping track of the work that we're doing is to go to our website, which is northstartransition.org. Or you could express your interest in getting involved by sending us an email at info@northstartransition.org. And one of the team from the Wye Usk Transition Lab will get in touch with you and share information.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time today. So appreciated. And you're really excited to see where this goes next.
That was exactly what I needed to hear today, I think. It is exciting to know that there are very, very smart people, of which we've met a number of his team as well, working on this problem. It's also really easy to sit here and poke holes into why it isn't going to work. And I like the fact that he welcomes those holes being poked and assuming that his team are open-minded to bringing those ideas on board and listening to them and then implementing that in version 0.2 of the document or whatever, then, I can see this growing and getting traction.
Definitely. And I could feel my discomfort levels rising a bit as soon as anyone starts to mention this idea of investable. Part of my anxiety is like, isn't the idea of investments and growth part of what has got us into this problem in the first place? But ultimately, there's something about appreciating the context that we're existing within. And can we be transformative whilst also taking advantage of some of the current economic ways that we've established ourselves as a society?
I hope to, maybe getting back on again, because there's a number of topics there that we didn't really do justice to, and we should have, would have been nice to have dug deeper into. Things like, how do you integrate and drive change within a government organisation? Once you've done that, or like you just said with investable, what does that actually mean? Does that mean that the farms will end up with a chunk of their farm being owned by these people looking to invest in them, or are they going to be loans? And I think there's obviously all of that devil is in the detail, but I think that's a really important question, because obviously farmers don't like the idea of losing a percentage of their farm to outside influences, which I can understand.
And if that capital has come out of a extractive economic system that is still busy extracting around the rest of the world, then are you not sort of robbing Peter to pay Paul? I don't think I understand enough about it to have an informed debate on this subject.
No. And like you said, we are in the system we are in, and we have the solution has to come out of the system that we're in, because there's no point saying, if only we could just all be nicer and do it better for each other, because that's not the system we're in.
I think what I really appreciated about the conversation is this idea of moving away from the magic bullet. As humans, we have such a desire for sort of certainty and maybe quite a reductionist perspective. That feels comfortable to us, it feels safe. And there's a real challenge in the invitation to sort of hold complexity and sit with uncertainty. And I can again feel people saying, well, what's it actually going to do? But actually letting go of what the outcome's going to look like, trusting in the process and the intention and some of the theoretical system framework that's behind some of these ideas takes a lot of courage. And I'm just really grateful there are people like North Star Transition willing to hold that process.
Yeah. And my final point, which is one that I bleat on about forever, I think it's important for people like North Star to bring people along the journey with them. And I think that's to do with communication, it's to do with marketing, it's to do with being transparent and not just writing a 40-page report and saying, look, we're transparent, but actually, how do we engage our stakeholders where they actually are, not where we want them to be? And I think that's an area probably to be explored, because the people they have to convince are the ones they're probably not talking to now.
I think it's such a valuable point, and hearing Jyoti's intention to bring on all of those perspectives is really admirable. But ultimately, you're going to have to work to make that happen. They're not going to be the ones that organically join the movement as a result of word of mouth. You're going to have to be proactive in really engaging some of those harder to reach voices.
Giving them a reason to join. Is that enough reflection, do you think? This is quite a long episode already.
There could always be more to say, but I think we should pause at this point for risk of getting caught up in too many debates and complex discussions that actually we've covered so much that I think there's more than enough for listeners to take away from the conversation.
I have been looking at the reviews of the podcast, which is always a scary thing to do, but it actually is great. And one of the most recent reviews, they actually say that they really enjoy our reflection at the end.
I think that puts some more pressure on the quality of our reflection.
Should redo it. On that note, if you do want to support the project and the podcast and you've got this far, then we would really appreciate it if you do get an opportunity to rate and review wherever you listen to your podcast. It makes a massive difference. It also warms the cockles of our hearts if there's nice things to be said. Is that enough?
I think it is. Thanks, Tom.
See you next episode.